Hi, today's video is going to be about recommended books for the British tradition. Under the British tradition, I'm going to be including pre-Welsh, in other words, from the era of the Romano-Britons, Welsh, and the Arthurian legends. To start with, the Romano-Celtic period. I have this book here, Webster, Celtic Religion in Roman Britain. By the way, the titles and authors will be listed in the description. This book covers various topics relevant to the field, sections on sanctuaries, gods, rituals, and so on. It does go a little bit too far, in my opinion, in identifying British things based on Irish evidence, so be careful with that. It's unfortunately something you're going to run across a lot, primarily probably because we have so much Irish evidence and so little evidence from Britain. This next book is by Anne Woodward. It's called Shrines and Sacrifice. It's from the English Heritage series. It's written from an archaeological point of view. There are a lot of really good pictures in here, graphs, maps, various illustrations, drawings, photos, etc. Very detailed sections on belief and ritual, on the gods. Very good section, as to be expected in a book on shrines and sacrifice, on the structure of Romano-British shrines. This book, Anne Ross, Pagan Celtic Britain, is probably the most famous book on the subject and one of the most important. Very many photos and drawings in this book of various artifacts, many of various deities. In the text itself, she divides them up into various topics, animals, for instance, the horned god, heads, the head cult, etc. There are a fair number of illustrations from Gaul as well as from Britain when she's trying to compare with the British ones, hoping to get more information on the British ones by looking at the Gaulish ones. Sometimes she goes a little bit too far, in my opinion, particularly in identifying links between British and Gaulish and Irish traditions. But it's always a useful book, and I highly recommend not just trying to find it for borrowing, but actually finding a copy to buy yourself. After the Romans leave Britain, we go into an era of decline in our information of Celtic paganism within Britain. The Anglo-Saxons come in and take over, and the Welsh and Scots survive as the representatives of the Celts. It isn't until the medieval period that we start to see things appear again, this time in Wales. The primary one is the Mabinogi. You also see it as the Mabinogion, which actually is an incorrect interpretation of the word. You'll find this in a number of translations. There's one by Lady Charlotte Guest, which you'll find on the internet for free, but I highly recommend against it. It was published during the Victorian era, and it was rather bowdlerized. For instance, there's a scene where two characters end up in bed together. There isn't any sex there, but they just spend the night together, and they're unmarried. In fact, one of them's married to someone else. And her version just says they went to bed, whereas the actual version describes a conversation they had in bed, and that conversation is a very important plot element. So I'd recommend not reading her version of it. These are the two most popular ones currently in print. This is the Mabinogi and Other Medieval Welsh Tales, translated by Patrick K. Ford, who teaches at Harvard, and the Mabinogion, translated and introduced by Geoffrey Gantz. I've been fortunate enough to find a hard copy of this in a used bookstore, but it is available from Penguin in softcover. It was actually the first book I ever read on the Celts. Ford's translation is considered more reliable. It's certainly more recent. It has what are called the four branches of the Mabinogi, and then the more Welsh tales, Llydd and Llywelys, Culhwch and Olwen, the Tale of Gwion Bach, and the Tale of Taliesin. Gantz, on the other hand, has the 4 branches, but also has the medieval French romances. They're Welsh, but they're influenced by the French. Things such as Prydein, which is one of the earliest examples of the Grail legend. It doesn't, however, have Taliesin in it. So if you want to complete the collection, you really end up having to have both. The Mabinogi gives you the earliest ones. The Mabinogion gives you a less reliable translation, but still good enough, and the medieval romances. So I recommend getting them both. This is a photocopy of the Trioedd Prydein, the Welsh Triads. It was translated and edited by Rachel Bromwich. This is the 2nd edition. Before she died, she did put out a 3rd edition. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to track that one down. The Triads are both useful and frustrating. They were lists of things in sections of 3, obviously, for storytellers to keep track of their stories and to make sure that they knew the ones that were necessary to know, and so on. So you'll end up like the 3 faithful war bands of the island of Britain, and then it lists these 3 things. It hints at more things than it actually tells, which is kind of frustrating because you look at this and you realize just how many stories we've lost. But still, there are some interesting little bits of information in there. What's really best about this book is the section of the notes where she references a large number of poems that it's unlikely you'll be able to have access to. I know I don't, particularly in English translation, which gives depth to the characters. You find out a lot about popular figures such as Arthurian and Carey. It's important to remember when reading these Welsh books that everything we have from Wales is from the Middle Ages, and you can't treat the Mabinogi as if it were records of actual myths. They're literary creations. Somebody sat down, took a number of myths, made up their own plot, wove them all together. It came with some really good stories. I recommend them for people who are just interested in Welsh or just interested in good stories. So you can't look at them and say, this is a myth about Rhiannon, for instance. But you could say, this tells us something about what the pagan predecessor of Rhiannon must have been somewhat like. So be careful with these. But still, you need to read them because that's pretty much what we've got. I have 3 books here that are on the Celts in general that include a lot of Welsh information. This is a Celtic Miscellany. This is edited and translated by the same man who did this translation of the Mabinogion. No, I apologize. I'm wrong about that one. Sorry. It's got a collection in it of excerpts and poems from a variety of sources. Most of them are Irish, as to be expected, but there are a fair number of Welsh ones, including some that are seasonal that would make really good ritual material. The Celtic Heroic Age, edited by John Koch and John Carey. Selections from, again, classical authors, Irish authors, and so on. It includes in the Welsh section the translation of Prydein, which is a story about Arthur raiding the underworld, which is very interesting and relevant to Welsh paganism at least. This is a secondary source, Celtic Heritage by Alwyn Rees and Brynley Rees. It analyzes Celtic myths, which means Irish and Welsh, from an Indo-European point of view, especially Dumazilian, for those of you who are knowledgeable about Indo-European topics. Again, largely Irish, but there's also a fair amount of Welsh in it, and a lot of the Welsh is illustrating the Irish and vice versa. So those are the books specifically about Welsh paganism. As far as Arthur is concerned, the relevance of Arthurian legend to Celtic paganism is a little bit unsure. There are certainly Celtic strains surviving in it, certainly some pagan themes surviving in it, but those who have taken the Arthurian legends as if they are fairly direct depictions of Celtic religion or of ritual really have taken the topic too far. But it's still useful for those who are interested in Celtic topics, and it's interesting in and of its own light. What I'm going to do here is give you the names of a couple of the primary sources. I don't have any secondary sources that I consider reliable enough to recommend, but if you ground yourself strongly in the primary sources, you'll be able to evaluate the secondary sources much more effectively. I'm only going to mention a few of these. I have a fair number, as you can see, but the full information on them will be in the description. This book here, The Celtic Sources for the Arthurian Legend, edited by John B. Koch and Simon Young. As it says, it's a collection of excerpts from a variety of sources. There are some sections from the Mabinogi, for instance, and there are some from the Trioeds as well, but there are a lot of other ones from various sources, various poems primarily. And obviously it's just the Celtic sources. A lot of our sources for Arthur are actually from France or from Germany, so this limits it to the Celtic sources. In the Mabinogion, or the Mabinogi, as I pointed out earlier, there are Arthurian elements, how Cilhwch and Olwen deals with Arthur. There's the Prydein in there, which is one of the earliest Grail legends, and so on. So if you're interested in Arthurian stuff, you'll want to read the Mabinogi. I would recommend, in this case, reading Gantz's version. This is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, translated by Tolkien, actually. It's a great story in and of itself, and it seems to preserve some Celtic elements. There are some elements in it that have parallels in Irish stories. Its emphasis, of course, is on Gawain rather than on Arthur, and that's something you'll discover reading a lot of the primary sources, that most of them don't tell you that much about Arthur. They're mostly talking about his various knights. But this is a great story, a very fun story, and like I said, there are some parallels with Irish stories, so there's a good chance there's a lot of Celtic stuff in there. Geoffrey of Monmouth, The History of the Kings of Britain, one of the earliest sources of Arthur. He's only a small part of the book, of course, so if you're only interested in Arthur, probably best to just find this somewhere at a library so you can read that section. The Morte d'Arthur, 2 volumes by Sir Thomas Malory, very long. Personally, I found most of this very tedious. It's primarily framed by what you think of as the Arthurian legends, how he became king, and then the final battles. The Once and Future King by T.H. White, that the play Camelot was based on, is based on this, but essentially based on the beginning and the end of this. In between are stories of all his knights and all their adventures, and those get rather tedious after a while. They're fairly similar to each other. So if you're very interested in Arthur, you're going to want to plow through it. If you're just slightly interested in him, I recommend reading the beginnings of it and the end of it. So that's what I've got for today. If you're studying British paganism, you're going to be wanting to study the Romano-British stuff, the Welsh, and to a certain extent the Arthurian material. It's a rewarding field, but it's a very difficult one because our sources are so limited and complex to understand. Comparing the Romano-British to the Welsh ones, for instance, we have to try to make sense of what we can say was a survival and what we can say was made up by the people who actually wrote the medieval texts. So that's what I have for today. As I said earlier, the titles and authors will be in the description. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to either PM me or put something in the comments. Thank you. Bye.